Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and final segment of week 3. We've had a really full week today, but I hope it's been eye-opening and heart-opening and mind-opening experience for you. Now we're just simply going to go over the readings. This will be quite a bit a shorter video. Frankly, they have to do with mostly the academic readings in the Ekman book. Chapter 6 in the Ekman book is on anger. We already did something on why is anger such a motivating emotion. That was in the intro video. So please make this the third section. If you haven't seen that video, see that first. We do an expanded discussion of this up here. And we're going on to the readings, reviewing some of the points made in the Ekman book, and revealing emotions revealed, and the 2 academic articles that were in week 6. Again, we'll have them up on the screen, so for some reason, with their citations, so if for some reason you want to go find them, either, and you're not a member of the class, you can. So, so let's just dive right in. Basically, we're going to focus on the motivations the link between motivations and emotion, specifically focusing on anger as one of the more motivating emotions. Last time I talked about it. In the other video, I talked about it here. They're going to bring up certain points. The chapter in Ekman is on anger specifically, and then the other ones has to do just with other emotions for the most part. Some of them do mention anger, but really linking more up with the physiological aspects of emotions and how they motivate us, or what motivate our emotions. So let's dive right into it. Anger. The face of attack of violence is anger. Separatist demonstrator on the right, well, this guy over here, we'll see that later, is demonstrating that. Again, Ekman really focuses on the facial expressions and so forth as a way of both signaling and even creating a sense of anger. Like he even has you make a face like that, and literally the facial structure can sometimes recall or create the feeling of anger, which is a very interesting idea. So his notion that anger is often around physical interference at a young age, like an infant's age. We've heard the others, and I expressed this in the other video. It's around thwarting, denying, slighting, these notions of someone kind of pushing against you, thwarting your will or forcing or doing something, and anger is a response to that. This is pretty much agreed to in this. Everything from physical interference. Again, that's why frustration is kind of a form of anger, because again, it goes to that thwarting response. So that's the first page. This is the second page, 111. We see here, again, an example of anger, clear anger on the face, this demonstrator attacking this police person, or it could be the reverse. And here's a nice little summary. As mentioned in the last chapter, rejection by a loved one can produce not only sadness but anger as well. Some spouses or lovers who become enraged when they are rejected batter their spouses. Anger controls, anger punishes, and anger retaliates. We really went into the automatic sort of built-in justification that anger brings with it in the last video. So again, if you haven't seen that one, please see the intro video first before watching this. One of the most dangerous features of anger is that anger calls forth anger, and the cycle can rapidly escalate. We talked about escalation in Latin, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's that source notion of a cycle, a vicious loop, where someone thwarts another person, and that other person feels thwarted, strikes back, then that other person feels like they've been thwarted, and it just keeps on going. Like I said, with anger, a lot of times people send an extra message to say, don't mess with me. And then the other person takes it as aggression. And they're like, you're messing with me. You take this, don't mess with me. And then it keeps on going up. That's a very common dynamic in anger. And very few other emotions so rapidly and clearly escalate as anger does. That's, again, why it's one of the more motivating emotions, precisely because it can activate, it can have its appraisal and everything in it, and it has something in its own nature that kind of naturally tends to escalate. So here we keep going. This is the next page. One would argue that frustration, another person's anger, a threat of harm, and being rejected are all variations of the interference theme. So he's really focusing on interference or thwarting. Even anger at someone who advocates what we consider wrong could be considered a variation of interference. So like when you have a righteous anger around some injustice you see is kind of still, by identification, you being thwarted or someone trying to restrict someone's liberties or not respecting someone that you identify with or ally with. Say you're a person allied with gay people and you're a straight a person who believes in gay rights and you see them being mocked or you see them being excluded from marriage, for instance. That would be an example of that, getting angry or righteously angry and considering that an injustice. Here are different forms of anger that Ekman talks about. Indignation, self-righteous anger, we just talked about that. Sulking is a passive anger. Exasperation refers to one's patience being tried excessively. Again, that sense of being thwarted or being pushed on. Revenge is a type of angry action usually committed after a period of reflection about an offense. Again, resentment is this notion of extended anger, an anger that feeds on itself and continues to stay in a cycle. We talked about the vicious cycle and resentment being an example of that. So that's page 112. We're moving to 113 now. We're also likely to feel disgust and contempt. Okay, so again, those can be related. I've made them a different class of emotion because disgust and contempt really has to do with something I think different than anger. It really has something to do with like putting yourself above somebody, where anger in some ways is just coming right at somebody. So it may, anger or resentment may accompany disgust and contempt, but I don't think it has to. A lot of anger can be pretty honest, whereas contempt is snobbish. It's a kind of elitism. It's a belief that you're inherently superior to someone, and that doesn't require anger. So, in fact, it can often be quite cold. There's a little bit of talk about violence, how in the early ages we tend to kick out and use violence when we're angry, and then we learn to inhibit that response. Again, this is a theme you'll see over and over again in these books, this notion that avoiding or inhibiting negative responses is pretty much the only thing you can do. We don't believe that in this class. We're trying to go ahead and interrupt them, understand them, interrupt them, learn into them, and then transfer these emotions or transform them in the direction of their sort of positive opposites. So that's a little bit of a different approach in this class than you'll see in a lot of these books and academic papers. And again, this is an interesting point, that it's a person who harms without anger who is not understandable and who we often see as truly frightening. Like the mass murderer who is like, everyone thought was a nice guy, kept to himself and blah, 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 and all of a sudden, bam, or some of these school shootings was the same kind of thing. They tended to be loners, and then all of a sudden they exploded without any real sign. Well, and here it says there's a cost to showing our anger. Angry actions and angry words can damage a relationship. What's interesting is, according to Ekman, the research shows, did we put this down here? Let me see if I have it up here. No, okay. But the research shows, that getting our anger out, something advocated by some psychologists, usually makes matters worse. Carefully reviewing the research, she concludes, that's a person on the previous page, that suppressed anger does not in any predictable or consistent way make us depressed, produce ulcers or hypertension, or set us off on food binges, or give us heart attacks. Suppressed anger is unlikely to have medical consequences if we feel in control of the situation that is causing the anger. So basically what this is saying is that expressing your anger and sort of getting it out is actually not a good idea. It doesn't help the person doing it, and like it says here, it tends to damage relationships. Interesting research thing, because it kind of goes against intuition. So an interesting point here. Again, he says the main benefit of being aware and attentive to our angry feelings is the opportunity to regulate or suppress our reactions. Again, I'm going against that. I'm saying no, it's an opportunity to not do damage, yes, but then we need to take the learning turn to get at the roots of where our anger is coming from. Our sociocultural variables, our family variables, our environmental variables, our way we were raised, the emotional patterns with which we were raised, and we begin to learn these and unravel the unconscious automatic expression of anger and begin to understand it and rewire or reestablish more positive ways to address a ambiguous or difficult or anxious, anxiety-producing situation instead of just reverting to anger to sort of blow it off. We develop a more sophisticated and positive and constructive response. So again, a lot of these books are written by academics who probably don't have the highest, they have very high IQs, but maybe not huge EQs. That is, I don't want to judge, but I'm just saying, if you're spending all your time developing your intellect, developing a practical understanding of emotions and relationships is probably going to take a bit of a backseat. Not going to say that anyone's incapable of that, but emotional intelligence is something you actually have to practice. You have to engage on the street in relationships with people in your family. And I have to say this class is doing a wonderful job of this in terms of trying the experiments I'm putting out there to try to see how emotions come out in relationships. And I'm also very, very impressed by the introspective and reflective capacities for people to work through actual situations involving anger and other emotions and see what is at the root of them. If you can begin to do that, then we can begin to construct an alternative way to respond. So again, kudos to you on this. If our spouse or lover has, this is up here, has managed to offend us by what they have said and done instead of retaliating in order to repair our wounded self-esteem, we might be able to recognize that being under great stress, they couldn't realistically be held responsible for their behavior, and in fact, not in control of themselves, and it would be best to assume that the basic intention was not malevolent or evil or harmful. Now, you could say this could be enabling bad behavior, but for the most part, see, here's another response we could, instead of just avoiding, we can empathize and say, okay, I accept this behavior because I'm either assuming or I'm allowing some kind of stress that they're under may have driven this behavior and not allowed them to be very conscious about it. Very, very helpful remarks. Please read the whole chapter on Ekman, but those are some of the highlights. The next one is by Jay Reeve. It's chapter 3 from Understanding Motivation and Education. It's a nice, clean article. It gets Dr. Zeus's seal of approval. So go ahead and read through this. I'll just try to touch on the highlights again real quick. The more you diet, the hungrier you get. This is really interesting. Saying diet is not about will, okay? It's about working with yourself if you really want to develop better habits toward eating. The hunger-causing culprit is probably ghrelin, okay? Ghrelin is a hormone manufactured in the stomach, circulated in the blood, detected and monitored by the brain. When a person goes for an extended period of time with little or no food, i.e. diets, the stomach and intestines detect the lack of nutrients and begin to manufacture and release ghrelin in the bloodstream. Ghrelin is an appetite enhancer, okay? Your body thinks you're starving and it's trying to motivate you to go out and eat, okay? Before, when we grew up, evolutionarily, we would never have an overabundance of food. So this would work, but now we have not only overabundance of food, but fatty foods and processed foods that really, really create other kinds of problems for us, like heart diseases and so forth. So going down here sort of gets to it. The message that diet-induced food deprivation leads the body to generate a potent counterforce against further dieting and food deprivation, i.e. a spike in ghrelin, okay? So again, it's not so much about will, it's also about chemistry. On a more optimistic side, the body also has hunger suppressing hormones, okay? One called leptin, actually. So again, you could chemically try to induce some of these things, but there might be a more effective way. And here's actually a graph that shows you that what happens in terms of ghrelin production when you are not dieting after people are dieting. That's why you have yo-yo diets. Is because it's creating a chemical situation in the body that's creating hormones that are actively creating pressures on you to increase your hunger. And then oftentimes people try to use the willpower to fight against that chemical response, which is a natural chemical response based in our evolution. They get tired and fatigued, okay? Going back to the first article in the first week, and then they give in, okay? Stop trying, they don't want any longer to fight themselves. So again, what we're trying to do is create alternatives. Like I said, positive addictions, a way to funnel and maybe take a more comprehensive approach so that this thing won't cave in. Okay, the brain is not only a thinking brain, it's also the center of motivation and emotion. It generates cravings, needs, desires, pleasure, and the full range of emotions. In other words, as the brain performs its functions, it cares not only about what task it is doing, using a cognitive intellectual function, but also very much cares about whether you want to do it, which is the motivated brain, and what your mood is while doing it, the emotional brain. Again, the brain is all these things, and they don't work in a hierarchy. They pretty much work laterally. They work co-equally. All motivation and emotional states involve brain participation. To check such a claim, try an experiment on yourself by trying to experience anger, hunger, or curiosity without first recruiting the participation of the brain. That might be an interesting one just to try yourself, okay? But of course, yes, the brain is the great switchboard or central train station for our thoughts, our feelings, and in fact, a lot of what goes on in our body in terms of hormones. So that's a little bit self-evident, but it's worth restating. Okay, again, there are 3 principles here. I won't spend a lot of time on them, but it just says the specific brain structures generate specific motivations, okay? So there's a place in the hypothalamus that increases hunger. There's another place in a different part of the same thing that actually increases fullness or satiety, okay? Satiety. So being satiated means you're full, okay? So basically it goes backwards. And then it says there are biochemical agents that stimulate the specific brain structures to generate specific emotions, okay? So if you understand the rise and fall of motivational states, we need to now look at neurotransmitters and hormones, which affect the brain and the brain's expression, which then affects your motivation. And then finally, it says the day-to-day events, stimuli, emotional triggers, we talked about this, right? Stimulate the hormones, which stimulate the brain, which stimulates certain emotional or motivational states. So that's, again, sort of the chain of interaction. It shows it here. It gives a couple examples. Food deprivation, dieting, right, is the environmental event. The biochemical agent is ghrelin, which we talked about, right, which stimulates the hypothalamus to increase your hunger, and then the motivation is to eat, basically. And the same is true going the other direction. You have an environmental substance. Remember we said surprise is a very motivating thing because it really drives this whole biochemical change. Unexpected pleasant event occurs, surprise, right? Biochemical agent, dopamine. Dopamine is this sort of happy drug that gets substituted with when people get addicted to things like cocaine. And this dopamine stimulates limbic structures in the brain, which arouse emotions of feeling pleasure and positive affect, okay? My point here is that what we can do is if we link a difficult emotion like vulnerability and we stay with it and we learn into it, we actually might consciously stimulate a pleasant response, and we might consciously stimulate even dopamine to be released because we're figuring out about it and we're staying with it and we're being okay. And being able to successfully do that can create a sense of victory or success. And then that could drive one of these virtuous cycles where you're releasing dopamine, you're feeling good about what's happening. You're surprised that you're able to get over a conflict. Like one of the examples there about wedding, when the two families had a little bit of tension before there, and one family decided, let's just, even if they say something inappropriate or combative, we're just going to be mellow about it. And because it worked and the wedding that the two families came together over was a success, that can kind of reinforce this virtuous cycle, including the environmental, biochemical, brain structures, and aroused emotions and motivations. So again, that's sort of what we're trying to do. We're trying to get what would normally create a negative response with the hormones released in the brain that create dampening or depression or anger, and do it the opposite. Same situation, but we interpret it and interact with it differently, so it creates a virtuous cycle because we're successfully confronting conflict without causing a big blow up or destruction. So again, it'd be interesting to do research on two groups that had the same emotion and environmental stimuli. One of the groups was trained to become emotionally intelligent and to see the so-called unpleasant emotion in a more positive learning standpoint, and was giving skills and strategies to move it into a positive arena, okay, and see what their dopamine and their hormone releases versus another one who wasn't given that instruction. They just react and they start clashing and being combative and so forth. I'm not going to, that would be a really interesting experiment. If any of you are doing research in the future, feel free to steal that one. I'm not going to probably have the time to do it, okay? But that would be an interesting experiment, and you could do it. You could do an experiment on that. It would require some research capability. But anyway, again, look at this. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time in it. It's on page 54. It talks about the brain structure, and it talks about the associated motivational or emotional experience. So if you have some curiosity about physiology, different parts of the brain are associated with different emotions and different motivational things, like the hypothalamus, pleasurable feelings associated with feeding, drinking, and mating, all the way down to avoidance-oriented structures, arousal-oriented structures, the reticular formation. I'm not going to get into that so much. We're not here in biology class or psychobiology, so I'm going to let you just go ahead and examine that. Okay, again, we're getting back to emotional learning here. Brain-generated approach versus avoidance. Much of the motivated brain's activity is organized around generated an excitatory yes, I want to, readiness to approach objects and events in the environment, or an inhibitory no, I don't want to, avoidance of objects and events in the environment. What we're trying to do is move you people in this class from a no, I don't want to avoidance of conflict and uncomfortable emotions to saying, yes, this is interesting. And if I engage it successfully, I will have better relationships and more successful life. So there is a positive motivation to engage it rather than simply a negative motivation to avoid it. And again, too many of the academic readings really emphasize the avoidance and suppression. I'm trying to avoid the learning into the proactive engagement, the transformation, and the reversal or the transformation of these things into something positive. So the yes response kind of increases your EQ or emotional intelligence, emotional awareness. There's an empowerment and a capability that you can build when you take that. The no, right, tends to lead to more emotional shutdown and fear. And it tends to, what in my estimation anyway, lower your emotional intelligence or your EQ. Helping others and yourself be more aware and organize emotional world and develop strategies, just like in our group assignments that I mentioned in the other video, can develop a new pattern, a rewiring in your brain that can allow you to feel right about approaching even uncomfortable emotions. And that's sort of what we're getting at here, okay? There's a nice thing about talking about the three main hormones in the body. Cortisol, the stress hormone, right? It actually is activated in the face of socio-evaluative threats like social judgment. Really interesting. It's the stress hormone, right? Elevated cortisol has been associated, stress, with poor intellectual functioning. So it affects your cognition. Again, the link between thought and feeling. And negative affect, poor health outcomes, and so forth. The steroid hormone testosterone associated with high sexual motivation and arousal, but it also encourages competition and probably anger and these sorts of things as well. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is known as the bonding hormone, the tend and befriend stress response that helps people reach out. Again, this is where the sociocultural variable of gender really becomes into the fore, because testosterone is higher in males, tending toward this competitive. Oxytocin, especially during pregnancy and so forth, kicks in, and it has this sort of opposite effect. It's a source of motivation for women in these cases, as it promotes a third possible and highly effective coping response versus fight or flight. It is mainly to nurture, right? To befriend, tend, and befriend. So again, we're everything. We are mental, we're emotional, we're physical and biological, and these things actually do interact. It's interesting to find out the connections between them. The motivation we know this, cannot be separated from the social context in which it is embedded. People have needs such as those for survival and well-being, okay? And anything can affect us, whether it's the weather, a relationship, it doesn't matter. We've kind of gone over this. Uh, yeah. And I don't think I really have to go too into this, but there is something at the end saying we are not always consciously aware of the motivational basis of our behavior. Again, fear and manipulation of emotions, that's our next week. And we are going to get into this and to find out how we're being unconsciously manipulated and exploited in commercials, for instance. So that's a good entry point into that. And we want to, like I said, we want to move from the unconscious to the conscious. So we have choice, better outcomes, and less harm. The brief lesson behind these empirical examples is that the motives, cravings, appetites, desires, moods, needs, and emotions that regulate human behavior are not always immediately obvious or consciously accessible. But here's the point we make in this class. They can become consciously accessible if we approach and learn into these emotions and not simply back away or ignore them. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot more time. We're already at the 25-minute mark, and I try to promise to make this shorter. But this is a kind of an obscure and wordy and contradictory. This guy tries to be deliberately provocative and challenge, which I like, okay, but the way he's challenging doesn't do a whole lot for me. He does get into anger a little bit. It's talked about here. The way people construe our social situations have caused significance for their emotional reactions. Aristotle suggested that people are made angry by the thought that they are being unfairly slighted. We already talked about that. And Aristotle wrote that anger may be defined as a belief that we or our friends have been unfairly slighted, which causes in us both painful feelings, right? And a desire or impulse for revenge or recovering. We spent so much time on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I will say that there is a complex. This article, like the other one, says there is a complex where cognition, that is thought, motivation, and emotion, that is basically feeling, affect each other. He calls it the trilogy of mind. Again, there's always a cognitive bias in a lot of these articles. I'm not, we've talked about this too. Cognitive activities to guide us, okay? Otherwise, we would not grasp the significance of what was happening in our mouth. That's what is interesting about cognition. It informs and analyzes and organizes our emotional reactions. And it helps us develop explorations into this class back into emotions. But if we simply use our mind to capture emotions and don't appreciate how emotions inform the mind and really are a positive generation to our passion and to our life, as Ekman said in his introduction, then I think we're really, really missing the boat. A lot of people, especially people in academic or intellectual environments, are somewhat intimidated by the passions or appetites like the ancient Greeks talked about. They're not just passions and appetites. They give meaning and a fullness to our life. And we should not allow ourselves to be persuaded or tempted to think of emotions as simply detracting from high intellectual and refined life. They are an important and intrinsic and essential part of a refined life. Okay, a lot of this was him trying to be a little bit controversy. Well, and again, he kind of defined cognition as inherently involved in emotion. So he says kind of, by the way he defines it, he says that emotion cannot occur without cognitive activity. But that's kind of silly. Most of what we do in terms of unconscious engagement is not really involving cognitive activity. It maybe involve past patterns that have been established by cognitive activity or by reactions, but not really cognitive conscious activity. So I found that to be a little bit spurious, meaning a little dubious. It's not a really helpful comment. So I don't really have a lot to say about this. You can read through it. There are some decent points in here. He does reinforce this notion of automatic, what we call automatic, knee-jerk, reflexive, right? Versus reflective, conscious, and he uses the word deliberate, right? He says automatic versus deliberate. We've used all kinds of things. But the main thing here is that, yes, we have unconscious and conscious, automatic and more deliberative ways of addressing our emotions, okay? Preconscious or unconscious versus conscious. But the point is that our unconscious or preconscious motivations, and emotions can be accessed. And I think that can be proven. I think that you've already shown it in the examples that you've given me Once you took the time to actually use your brain, your cognition, to analyze and to go into the examples that we've been doing in this class, you're literally changing your brain. You're changing your understanding of those emotions, and you're changing your behavior and your patterns. That's already evidence from what you've been doing. So I have to say, you're proving, you're proving that cognition and emotion can inform each other very nicely and change actual patterns and behavior. Um, so it does talk about cognitive process being kept out of awareness to cope with threat, and that sometimes happen, right? And that oftentimes happens in these more unconscious situations. But I want to say, so what? Okay, the thing that matters is that, if it was unconscious at one point, that we understand why we kept it out of our cognitive. Perhaps we felt like we weren't up to really examining that emotion or being able to deal with it, but we shouldn't make that simply something we do forever, just avoid or suppress. We need to find a supportive environment that allows us to go in there without high risk and actually find out and learn and develop emotions in a more positive direction. So that's basically it. Great. We're at 30 minutes, and that should it. I was scrolling a bunch on the bottom here, and then I ended up actually just making this emotional perception versus reality, which I explained in the last video, so I won't do it here. But now you can kind of see my thought. I'm like, I'm disagreeing with this guy. I'm saying, wait, there's an alternative. Wait, hey, this gives me an example. And then I keep going up the side of the page. Well, this scrawling here, if you can see it, if you want to understand my thinking, engaging emotion, came out into this notion about showing how vulnerability or loneliness can create a defense response like anger that actually makes the loneliness or the vulnerability worse. And so again, the solution was not to see vulnerability as a threat in the first place that you have to react to. Develop a higher emotional intelligence, learn how your perceptions arose, transform your conversation with your feelings, create learning and acceptance in a new pattern, learn to rewire yourself, and so forth. So feel into, right, the emotion versus avoid it. Enhance well-being, right, rather than causing pain for yourself. This is the virtuous loop that I'm hoping you all begin to develop some practice with in this class. So that's pretty much it for readings. I realize I've got probably about, almost an hour and a half, like a full-length movie worth of stuff, maybe even close to an hour and 45 minutes, 2 hours. But again, it's going to set you up nicely for the group project. I want to give some time to the wonderful contributions you yourselves have made. And I want to help you really develop these skills and allow yourself to move into a positive engagement, even with negative or painful or difficult emotions, and realize it's okay. You can hold them in their space. You can investigate them. You can see how they interact. And you can use that knowledge to learn into them and begin to interrupt, unconscious things that are destructive to relationships, and even learn to move a negative or antisocial emotion into a positive and pro-social emotion. So that's what we're going to do, and it seems so far like we're doing a pretty good job. Anyway, again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week, week 8. Bye.